Hello, my name is Frances Calder. I'm an interpreter who trained many moons ago after a modern languages degree at the Commission and stayed there for a while and then spent the rest of my career still working for the EU, but as a freelance, working for institutions all over the place and for a long period, a great deal on the private market. And I was asked to talk to young people, i.e. people who are currently still undergraduates reading languages, or maybe people who are in their first year of postgrad, just about a different angle on interpreting, because it always sounds very poppy and glamorous and upbeat when you look at all the other videos around on the net. And I was asked to just think about other things that maybe it would be helpful to know. And I'd actually myself never heard of interpreting until some months after graduating. And I admire those of you who are already looking into it. But I never had the advantage of asking questions and knowing things that I might have been more realistic about, might have taken more care of, that might have put me off, I don't know. So this is a very general bird's eye view from one end of a career to people who are really just at the stage of thinking. And I might also add that my career at the institutions in Brussels has coincided brilliantly with the UK joining and then apparently leaving the EU. And I should add what effect that might have. At the moment it looks as if not much from the point of view of the English booth, because there's still the Irish, there's still all the other countries that speak English, and because it's reckoned that it will take at least 12 to 15 years of complicated meetings if we do Brexit. Now, the first thing that I wish I had known, it's always been the case that of the many who try, only a few actually make the good career in the end, which doesn't devalue studying interpreting because the skills are very transferable. And in an Anglophone world, languages add sparkle to any CV. But if you train in medicine or law, you can be relatively sure you'll be a doctor or a lawyer. Universities haven't cracked identifying the potential students who actually will end up as bona fide conference interpreters. So the job's a bit odd like that. And there's a rule of thumb in Brussels that you need about 2,000 linguists to find 500 or 600 potential translators and maybe 50 simultaneous interpreters. So it's not that easy. And added to that is the fact that the market is very hard to swim in. You're likely, if you become an interpreter, to be a freelancer. Most of us are. And you don't want to work for the shoals of language agencies who know there's a lot of money in the conference industry and it sloshes about on PR and cocktails and they want their cut. And they're not very interested in in the kind of interpreters that they hire for their clients. The international recruiters, institutional recruiters do know this, do understand it, but at the moment certainly they're all subject to budget reviews and cuts. So there's those two things, and the rise of Globish over recent years, which some people seize on as a way of reducing expenditure on languages, despite the fact that it's a very limited communication tool very often. But all of this doesn't mean you can't be an interpreter. If you understand what you're getting into. And the first thing, which may surprise people who are just at the very beginning of thinking about it, is that what you need above all is terrific mastery of your own mother tongue. Many qualified interpreters don't make it in the profession in the end because they don't understand register, they don't understand tone. You can't chat down the mic to delegates as if they were your mates in the wine bar because they are not your mates. It's difficult if you walk into a meeting and you announce the agenda and suddenly the chairman says they've lost someone. Is he dead? Has he resigned? Has he retired? You have to tread water until you find out. You have to be able to cope with all these situations. There's a lot more to being an interpreter than just being really good at foreign languages, because that's taken as a given. Your other languages, your passive languages, the ones that you work from, in the EU in the old days, offering two was fine. In fact, if you have German, offering 2 is fairly fine still. But at the moment, the EU would prefer it if you had 3, or if not that, 2, and a good grounding in the 3rd that they can see coming on stream. The other thing about languages, which I never knew, and nobody tells you because it's politically incorrect, is that languages have a commercial and political value. It's just the way life is, and you need to find out what value your languages have. The ideal is to aim for languages that are useful to the EU, to the UN, to the international trade unions, on the private market whose needs change all the time, because it's not likely that everybody will fire you at once. Somebody will still be employing you. If you're trying to be an EU civil servant, it's still not worthwhile spending years learning a language which nobody else will want to know. If you do become an EU civil servant, they will set you to learning an obscure language, and you then just hope that you get the chance to use it, rather than hearing your Bulgarian delegate, your Latvian delegate, speaking Globish all the time. And your passive languages will never be perfect. I still go into meetings and learn new words, because you're going into specialised fields all the time. That's normal. There's no reason to panic. You do learn things. I mean, in my first week at work, I added the name of the Italian delegate to a list of Italian cheeses. And after that, I tried to make sure that I always knew what the names of the delegates were. The third thing, which actually wasn't around when I began, excuse me, is the dreaded Globish. It's what Jacques Chirac contemptuously called the 1,200 words of international communication, and he wasn't wrong. It's a cross you have to learn to bear. In my experience, Globish is particularly poor in some of the EU institutions, and it's partly because of the sudden big expansion of the EU and the rise in English that was happening anyway. But in Brussels, that was superimposed on top of Brussels English, which was already a phenomenon in its own right. Actually, on bad days, I think Globish could start a world war. But it's something you have to deal with. The English booth is tortured by it, just listening. The other booths are tortured by having to decipher it. And it very often impedes communication. One example, 18 months ago, I was working in a meeting that was preparing for the upcoming International Whaling Commission's assembly. And a Globish-speaking delegate got up in the middle of a debate about bluefin tuna and dolphins being caught in nets and started going on about starfishes. And I was wondering what starfishes were doing in mid-sea nets, but the other booths were all talking about starfishes. And then it became clear that there was a muddle, and it emerged that she was actually talking about staff issues at the International Whaling Commission, and she blamed the interpreters. She didn't blame her poor pronunciation or her bad English grammar. But this is something that is not going to go away. And the particular problem that we have with Globish, I think, is that many non-native speakers can't admit to not being good at it. It would be like saying that you can't send an email or, I don't know, fix a light switch, anything. And many, too, don't know that they're not very good at it. And I get very tired in coffee breaks at meetings of being told by bad English speakers how easy English is. And I have a different tactic now, because I beam at them and say, yes, it's a low-entry language, wonderful for coffee breaks, but how awful for you to have to sit in that meeting with a language as subtle and difficult as English and communicate. And it's amazing how often they say, yes, it is difficult, I wish I didn't have to do it. But Globish is there. We have to take it into account. We have to guard against thinking that it's English. And this is particularly relevant for people who want to do a retour. A retour is when you work into another language, not your mother tongue. And if you're studying for a retour into English, and any retour is a good competitive advantage for you, it's no use thinking that the internet and listening to the BBC are any substitute for living in an English-speaking country. And the same is true, actually, for any passive language. You need to live a language in order to really get to know it. And nowadays, with the rise of the use of the internet, which has been a fantastic tool for learning languages, but you can tell straight away when a hopeful retouriste is relying on the internet and hearing Globish spoken every day. It's not good enough. And the delegates may not realise it, but the employers and colleagues recruit very often will recognise it. Pronunciation and above all inflection matter for English. It becomes robotic and comic and hard to listen to and therefore hard to understand. Globish speakers often don't realise this, but a retouriste must. Because if you do a retour into English, you're being paid to speak English to near native standard. And you have to be able to do that. 5. One thing that I thought when I first heard about interpreting was the glamour of interpreting. It sounded very exciting that you travel all over the place to the other side of the world in order to work. You go to wonderful places with important people that you read about on the news. And to some extent, this is true. You do. And you learn a lot about the way the world works and what happened behind the scenes. But most of the time, you fly to the airport, go to the conference hotel, do the conference, get taken out by the host to some meal in a traditional cheery hostelry, back to the airport and back home. And it can be tiring. But there have been times I had breakfast once 3 days running with 2 African presidents who were technically at war at the time in a small town in Germany with a German pastor. And that was one of the most fascinating things that I could have imagined being able to take part in, those breakfasts. But most interpreters are not living lives like Nicole Kidman in a massive great apartment overlooking Central Park. And most of us find the travelling tiring. And there was one occasion some years ago when I worked on consecutive days in Brussels, Luxembourg, Nordwijk, Munich, and then Louvain-la-Neuve. And I must have been nuts, I never did that again. But you have to be able to organise yourself. It's not something, if you can't control it, that combines easily with a family or staying healthy. But interpreting offers incredible flexibility if you make it work for you. And I'm talking of freelancers here. I have colleagues who write books, make films, breed and show horses, are serious potters, design and sell software. And the most important word they master in the end is no to some god-awful contract, because it probably is god-awful. Freelancers tend to say yes to anything. You have to learn not to. So this point really is about whether you're good at organising yourself and whether you would be able to deal with a life where you were basically a freelancer. 6. Now, oh yeah, this is when I first started work and I was inventing Italian cheeses. I fell asleep at 9 o'clock every night. Nobody had told me how absolutely exhausting the job can be. But you get used to it and you get to the stage where you can go out the night before you have to work. And you're young, so you'll do it. But interpreters have to have great stamina, physical and mental. And the German Ministry of Health some years ago decided to reassess all their employees for health insurance purposes and wired them up to physiological tests and discovered, they were really startled, that the interpreters were showing the same levels of stress as fighter pilots in jets. And in fact, the interpreters were rather worse because the pilots take off and land, but usually only once or at the outside twice a day. Interpreters go up and down when they're going on and off mic. And they had thought interpreters were like secretaries, they just sit there and they talk. But they had to reassess and upgrade the insurance. And that should be stressed, I think, from the very beginning of training, if that's what you're going to do. Look after your hearing, keep the volume on your mic feed turned down. Cultivate relaxing, preferably without abusing booze or cigarettes or controlled substances. I don't bother with the last one of those, but as a young interpreter, I was completely unaware of all this because I was naturally going to be immortal. But you may want to work for 20, 30, 40 years. And interpreting is known to be very good for warding off Alzheimer's. And ever since Google discovered that the amygdala comes into what we do, they've had to go back to square one in trying to produce machines to replace us, because it's not just the language neurons. We could have told them that. And mental stamina matters, because unlike delegates, we have the great pleasure of being able to wipe, delete, go home. They have to go out after a meeting and write reports. We just keep the glossary. But at the same time, during the meeting, we work more intensively than anybody there. Translators are working in fairly linear fashion. We're working with our minds jumping forwards, backwards, sideways, and our tongues have to keep up. You have to be able to keep going and sound calm and authoritative when you are trying to work out what the acronym was, what that word you didn't hear properly was, where's your colleague who went to get coffee. And you have to be able to block out that your dog died, that your child is at home ill, that you're getting divorced, or that you've won the lottery, because interpreters really can't have bad days. And that's something I think you need to learn very, very early on. The seventh thing about interpreters, or more about interpreting and interpreters, we tend to be fairly extrovert, although we do have the language nerds. We need language nerds. But I only realised how important it was to be outward-looking and calm as a personality when some years into my career I came across a diva, and it was a male diva, and there isn't a word for them, and there should be. But egotism and a lack of cooperation are not welcome anywhere. But this is a job where you can have 6, 8 people flying in from all points of the compass, and they meet behind the booth, and immediately they're a team. They know what each of the other needs. They know how they have to work with and help each other. There's no room for grandstanding. And then you finish the meeting and go home, and you may not see that team for 10 years, but the same thing will happen again. You're immediately a team. And some people find this side of the work unsettling. They might accept that there's no routine in meetings, subjects that you cover, but they might prefer a bit of routine in terms of people they work with. But I don't know, if you can't cope with a great deal of change all the time in that sense, maybe translating would be better. There's not any room for divas. We don't like them. And the permanently anxious, even if we like them, are unsettling and should not really be doing the job either, because they don't have the ability, which I think is vital, which is to walk in and work confidently immediately with a team that you haven't seen before. And you have to be tolerant. You can't sit there telling your colleague to go and wash off a perfume that you don't like, or to stop sucking a cough sweet because you don't like the scent. This happens in the booth, and you can't do it. You're there to do the job just for that day. You put up with it. You have to be tolerant with people. So linked to staying calm and mental stamina is the question of nerves and stage fright. And actors often suffer from bad stage fright, and they talk about doctor theatre. And doctor theatre cures nerves, stage fright, hangovers, raging temperatures, because when they go on stage, they know what they've got to do and they do it. And interpreting is very like that in some ways, because although you may spend much of your career hidden in a booth, you may have to stand up in front of a hotel ballroom full of 600 people to do a consecutive speech. You may find yourself in a field with 40 delegates and a herd of fascinated cows crowding round. And you have to make these people listen to you, and you have to make them want to listen to you. And this is where enjoying the performance side of the job comes in. If you don't get some kind of kick out of being able to reel them in, it may be difficult. I've heard it said that nerves and panic are good for the interpreter because it sharpens them, but actually I don't buy that. At the beginning of a career, it's natural to be nervous. It's natural to be nervous in the middle of a career. If you're in a press conference with a head of state saying something absolutely vital and very controversial, you're nervous. But most of the time, the people who are shyer, who don't really enjoy public speaking out in the public, they're probably better off to leave the profession. And most of the people I knew who couldn't hack the booth in the long term did that, and did associated jobs or worked around interpreting. But it was better for them, and it was better for the rest of us. During your working life. Now, this is something which I was aware of, largely because my mother once, when asked what her two daughters were doing, and my sister was reading medicine, and I had finished reading languages at Oxford, and my mother said to a friend of hers who asked, "Oh yes, she's gone to Brussels to learn to be an interpreter." And the friend leaned over and patted my mother's arm and said, "But wasn't she the one that went to Oxford?" And my mother said yes. And the friend said, "But what happened?" And so I was aware, even before qualifying, that people wouldn't know what your job was. Your family and friends will never really get it. 95% of the population won't get it. They think an interpreter is somebody who speaks another language. And the guy who comes to read the gas meter in this house every year is also an interpreter, he told me. He does it as a second job around reading gas meters. And so 95% of the world think like that. The other 5% think you're magic or something, which is flattering but over the top. But it doesn't matter very much, except that potential employers are almost always part of the 95% who don't know what you do. If you're a doctor, a lawyer, an IT specialist, a designer, people recognise you have a skill that they haven't got and they have to pay for it. With us, especially if you're talking to somebody who speaks more than one language anyway, they don't really see what you do that's different. They think they could do it, and they don't see what needs to be paid for. And institutional recruiters, of course, do know this. That's not a problem there. But you just have to spend your entire career, if you work in the private market as well, educating potential employers. And I usually tell them that their keynote speaker is not that guy with 15 degrees after his name speaking German at the lectern. For the audience, I am the keynote speaker. And that sometimes helps them get the idea of why it matters what we do. But even staff interpreters don't escape from that. This is something that you have to learn to deal with without losing it. I've seen package conference organisers being rather embarrassed when I came across their conference checklist. 2 A4 pages, about 48 different items that they had to tick the box as having organised it. And on page 2, the last 3 items at the bottom were arranging the bus tours for accompanying persons, providing the technicians with water, interpreters, and then ashtrays. So that was where we were. If you're worried about a job with instant status recognition, interpreting is probably not for you. So the last point, the 10th point, what does interpreting offer to compensate for the lack of status, the exhaustion, market swings, nervous breakdowns, all the rest of it? The pay is not bad. The pay is not bad. You would think, given our rarity, it should be higher, but then you have to remember the 95%. And you have to balance up the options. If you still feel that points 1 to 9 would not be a problem, in fact would even attract you, you still have to consider whether there's anything else that would encourage you to pursue this, because it won't be a walkover. It never has been. But there is genuinely always room for the best. And you will hear that all over the internet about interpreting. It is actually true. There is always room for the best. But there are 2 things that I've prized enormously over 40 years. One of them is the opportunity to enter so many different worlds, from politicians to women's groups to negotiators to beekeepers to you name it. And interpreters pick up the most extraordinarily varied information because, almost by definition, they're having a meeting because they're the experts. And you learn a great deal. You find out how the world works, how politics and negotiations actually work, how society functions. how trades unions negotiating with bosses, the press might be full of sound and fury. We said this, we refuse to accept that. But you see them chatting in the coffee break as well. So if you're curious about how the world works and what people do for work, interpreting is very hard to beat. And the other thing, which is a major thing, is that for me, colleagues have been a constant source of pleasure. Most colleagues are very individualistic, but they will just work in teams with partners without thinking. And I think it would be hard to find any job where I could have worked with such interesting, intelligent, tolerant, witty, quick-witted people, moral people, very professional people. You have to be. And the breadth of their passions and their experiences is constantly astonishing to me. So that, for me, is a major reason for pursuing interpreting, quite apart from the glamour and the delegates and whatever else, and hearing what prime ministers say in coffee breaks. And then I suppose the last thing is that I did, by accident really, I kind of fell into this, but I did end up with a job that was the holy grail of the modern languages undergraduate. I've used my languages. And it's worth pursuing. If that's what you want to do, do it. It's just important not to be completely starry-eyed, know what you're getting into.